Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's presentation, which is Reproductive Coercion and the Intersection of Intimate Partner Violence and Faith Beliefs, Reproductive Justice Theory and Practice. It's a big title, big subject. So I'll introduce our presenter in just a moment, but first we're going to go over some technical information. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with your sound, I recommend that you check to make sure your headphones or speakers are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend that you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try connecting again. That usually clears things up. We would love to have your questions today. Toni's looking forward to it. And you can submit your questions to me at any time during the presentation. Throughout the presentation, the audience members are muted. So if you want to send me information or a question, you can do that at any time. If you don't see the question box on your screen, click on the little orange arrow and that will open up the feature box and you'll be able to see the question and chat box there. The slide you see on your screen will be sent to you later this afternoon as a PDF document, so you will have the resources. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who couldn't join us for the live session. And I will also send you a link to the recording so you can share it with others who weren't able to participate. We are delighted to thank the United Methodist Women for sponsoring today's webinar. Today is a webinar. Our webinar is part of a series that they're sponsoring in 2016 as part of their domestic violence awareness campaign. The United Methodist Women mission is to provide opportunities to grow spiritually, equip women and girls to be leaders, provide transformative educational experiences, organize for growth and flexibility, work for justice through service and advocacy. Please visit unitedmethodistwomen.org to read more about the great work that they're doing. And again, we thank them for their sponsorship. Our presenter today is Toni Bond Leonard. She has worked for almost 20 years to make the voices of Black women heard around the issues of reproductive and sexual health. She's the co-founder and former president CEO of Black Women for Reproductive Justice, and she's served on the boards of advisory committees of numerous organizations, including Sister Song, Trust Black Women Partnership, National Network of Abortion Funds, and the Guttmacher Institute. In 1994, Toni was one of the 12 Black women who coined the phrase reproductive justice, which laid the groundwork for a whole new framework to advance reproductive health and rights. She's currently at Claremont School of Theology working on her PhD in religion, ethics, and society. So, Toni, I'm going to unmute you here. And, whoops, sorry about that, folks. Are you with me, Toni?
I'm here.
Okay, so I'm just going to launch this poll for attendees. So we'd love to know what your role is in addressing these issues. It'll certainly help Toni with the conversation today.
Mm-hmm. So, as Sarah said, we have a full agenda. And just to give you a brief overview, we're going to talk about what is this thing called reproductive justice? And we're going to talk about the theory and the framework of reproductive justice. And then we'll talk about religion and forms of reproductive oppression. And we'll talk about what it means to support survivors of intimate partner violence, holding reproductive justice theory and the framework. And then we can have some conversation about questions and answers and talk about resources. I wanted to talk about reproductive justice as a framework to use working to counteract forms of reproductive coercion. Next slide, please. So, the history of reproductive justice. The term reproductive justice was coined by 12 Black women in June of '94. We were attending a conference sponsored by Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance and the Ms. Foundation for Women, and the conference was centered around universal health care reform. And we got together and did what women of color tend to do at conferences where we represent a small minority. We caucused. And what we talked a lot about was the fact that the current plan for universal health care that was being proposed by the then Clinton administration did not fully speak to the totality of women of color and particularly Black women's lives and the unique reproductive and sexual health experiences and dilemmas that we were confronted with, including, for example, access to well women care, access to pre and postnatal care, access to the full range of contraceptives, access to safe and affordable abortion services, access to services around sexual assault, and access to services for domestic violence survivors. And so we put forth a call about what was needed to truly speak to and respond to this really broad need of women, because we understood that women brought their full selves and their whole lives to their healthcare needs. And so one of the things we did was crafted a sign-on statement that we had posted in the Washington Post with 835, the names of 835 Black women, including supermodel Veronica Webb, Alice Walker, just a number of notable celebrities. Many of the Black female legislators during that time signed on to it as well, and really calling upon the administration to think more broadly about and to include more broader issues in its universal health care plan. The other thing we did was crafted and issued a letter in support of then U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Jocelyn Elders when she was terminated for her perspectives and comments about the legalization of drugs and also promoting masturbation as a form of healthy sexuality for young people. And we also issued a letter in support of the proposed U.S. Surgeon General, which he did eventually become Surgeon General, Dr. David Satcher. And so this was the thinking around this collective of women, collective of Black women who came together and laid the foundation for the theory and the framework of reproductive justice. Next slide, please. The reproductive justice theory. So after we met in June of '94, some of the founding mothers attended the September 1994 United Nations conference on sponsored by the International Conference on Population and Development that was held in Cairo, Egypt. And at this conference, not only did I think we get affirmation about how we were approaching the work in the US domestically, but we really began to see that there were links between how we were doing the work domestically and how the work was being done by other women of color internationally. And so, you know, some of the debates that we heard at this conference talked about women's ability to control and realize the reproductive health and autonomy, but it was more than just right-centered, that it really had to take into consideration how women, specifically women of color's reproductive and sexual lives were impacted by issues like race, class, gender, environmental issues, access to food, access to safe and affordable housing, access to employment, that our ability to lead healthy reproductive and sexual lives very oftentimes are conditioned upon those other issues. And so we realized that the struggles of women in developing countries were similar to women in developed countries like the US. And so that was not only very affirming, but it made clear to us that the bodily integrity of women across the world, women of color across the world, continued to be under attack through socioeconomic policies that were really centered around controlling our bodies because of our race, because of our class, and because of our gender, and that those issues together had an intersectional impact. And so Loretta Ross, one of the RJ founding mothers, came back from that conference and really began to expand the reproductive justice analysis to add these intersectional issues and also to kind of add principles and language from the human rights framework into the RJ analysis, because RJ says by definition that women can't make decisions about their health, their body, their labor, their families, their children, our sexuality outside of the context in which we live. And so the Cairo conference really reinforced our understanding of the importance of individual rights in conversation, in dialectical relationship with what is happening in our own lives, our families, and in our communities. Next slide, please. So the three pillars of reproductive justice. When we created the initial framework and theory, we started with what every woman had the human right to, which was to decide if and when she will have a child and the conditions under which she will give birth. So, for instance, a woman may want to have the support of a doula in the room. She may very well want to and has the right to be able to craft her birthing plan from the beginning of conception all the way to labor, delivery, and post-labor and delivery. She has a right to decide whether or not she wants to have pain medication. She has a right to decide or have significant impact around whether or not she's going to have a C-section, and particularly if she has had a C-section before, the automatic response oftentimes doesn't have to be that she has to have cesarean birth in the future. It's possible to have a vaginal birth after C-section. So a woman has a right to have significant input into the conditions under which she's going to give birth. Every woman has a right to decide if she will not have a child and to have options for preventing or ending a pregnancy through the use of contraceptives, abstinence, or abortion, and to have access to the resources to exercise that decision. More specifically, in terms of the use of contraceptives, a woman has a right to access contraceptives under her own free will, and has a right to not be coerced or forced into using contraceptives if she does not want to, and also has a right to access to barrier methods of contraceptives, and has the right to access non-provider controlled methods of contraceptives. And what we mean by non-provider controlled, so for instance, contraceptives like Depo-Provera, like Implanon, like the IUD, the birth control pills. Those are provider-controlled methods of contraceptives. They are non-barrier methods of contraceptives that women really don't have any control over. The provider gets to control the dosage. The provider gets to control the method by which the contraceptives are given. And if a woman should want to stop using, for instance, if she's on Depo-Provera or on Implanon or on the IUD, it would may cost her considerable money, one, to have the IUD removed, and with Depo-Provera or Implanon, those can't be removed. You have to wait until the hormonal, the active hormonal effects end, and so they can't be removed, nor do they provide barrier protection. What is highly problematic about that for reproductive justice activists working with communities of women of color is that we know that most women do not dual contracept. You either use one method of contraception or not. Either you're going to use a condom or you're going to use a provider-controlled non-barrier method of contraceptives. We know that many women opt for the non-barrier method of contraceptives, but that only provides one aspect of protection. It only provides protection around preventing an unintended pregnancy, but it doesn't provide protection for contracting sexually transmitted infections like HIV. And so like HIV and chlamydia and herpes, and so we know that that is highly problematic for communities who are experiencing high rates of HIV, high rates of chlamydia, high rates of now gonorrhea, high rates of pelvic inflammatory disease. And so this makes it, very challenging when we're talking about doing safer sex education with women and communities. The third pillar of reproductive justice is that every woman has a right to parent her children with the necessary social and economic supports in safe environments and healthy communities without fear of violence from individuals or the government. So what this basically means is that every woman has the right to access healthy food to feed her children, to live in environments where she is not worried about whether or not her child is going to be a victim of gun violence, either from individuals in the community or from the police in the community. Every woman has the right to access not just food, but healthy food. So when we talk about, for instance, how healthy food does or does not get into poor communities, it's really the difference many times between whether or not a family who is getting monthly public assistance can afford $1.99 for a gallon of milk, or being able to purchase a half a gallon of organic milk that might be hormone free, that is going to cost them $4. And many times that family is going to go for the gallon of milk that costs $1.99. And also being able to live free from fear of violence from family members. So there's a lot to the pillars of reproductive justice. Over the years, the framework has been expanded to also include that all human beings are entitled to sexual pleasure. And so really, when you think about it, reproductive justice is a sex positive framework that talks about and supports all human beings having the right to experience their sexuality in healthy ways and in pleasurable ways. Next slide, please. So in terms of how reproductive justice broadens our strategic analysis, and we'll talk more about this as we get to more around how we think about the three frameworks, but in terms of how activists have historically worked on the issue of, for instance, abortion or privacy. And those issues have, pretty much alone defined the scope of women's reproductive health. But we know that the reproductive and sexual lives of people and the barriers that they must transcend encompass more than abortion. So we know that, and what the reproductive justice framework gives us is a way to talk more substantially in a more expanded way about, for instance, where does access to comprehensive sexuality education enter the conversation? Where do we have the conversation about violence against women, sexual assault? Where do we talk about how women are treated in the emergency room when they present as victims of sexual assault? What services are they offered? Are they being offered, for instance, Plan B or the morning after pill? Do they have access to rape victim advocates or court advocates who will advocate for them throughout the whole process? Where do we bring into the conversation about intimate partner violence and all of the many ways in which women's and not just women but LGBTQ community members, how their sexual and reproductive health is threatened in intimate partner relationships? Where do we have the conversation about access to contraceptives and what types of contraceptives, as I discussed earlier, and even the right to be sexual beings? So this is how reproductive justice really broadens our strategic analysis, because it gives us an opportunity to really develop new ways of how we think about reproductive and sexual health on a spectrum, and meaning a spectrum of people's reproductive and sexual lives. The other thing that it does is that it decentralizes power that has traditionally resided with individuals of privilege, with predominantly mainstream reproductive health and reproductive rights organizations that have created the agendas and driven the agendas. What reproductive justice does is that it puts those individuals who have been on the margins at the center of the discourse. And then in turn, they take on the leadership and set the agenda and drive the agenda as the experts through their lived experiences. And so one of the ways that we do that is that reproductive justice defines our common problem as reproductive oppression. And through doing so, we've developed this more inclusive and catalytic vision of how we need to move forward to include issues like violence against women and economic injustice in the environment, and where they all intersect, and how issues of race, class, gender, sexuality impact and impede individuals, women, from being able to be safe in relationships, safe in their communities, to have their sexuality threatened, to have their reproductive autonomy threatened. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the dimensions of reproductive justice, it's, three. Theory, which talks about intersectional theory and how it's based on the human rights framework. And also, so let me back up. So reproductive justice comes out of Black feminist theory and the human rights framework. And we took it and applied them both to reproductive politics. The strategy of reproductive justice really says, it requires us to work across social justice issues, to bring diverse issues and people together. And the practice involves what we call self-help, which comes out of the Black Women's Health movement through the National Black Women's Health Project, which is now called the Black Women's Health Imperative, and conflict resolution and using conflict resolution as a way to help diverse people work better together. But it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about the dimensions of reproductive justice, this is really applicable only if you are an organization that is trying to establish itself as an RJ, a reproductive justice organization. When we think about who reproductive justice groups are, we generally tend to think about those groups that have been founded and organized by women of color. For example, groups like Sister Song and Sister Love in Atlanta and Spark Reproductive Justice, and groups like New Voices Pittsburgh, Women with a Vision in New Orleans. Black Women for Reproductive Justice, when it was around, was a reproductive justice organization. Next slide, please. So what is reproductive oppression? Reproductive oppression, as it was defined in a white paper that was produced by Sister Song and Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, who is now known as Forward Together. They came together and did this paper in 2005, where they not only defined reproductive oppression, but also explained the reproductive justice framework and compared and contrasted it to the reproductive rights and reproductive health frameworks. But what they said about reproductive oppression, as you can see, they defined it very broadly. They talked about it as being the regulation and the exploitation of women and girls, both biologically and socially, through their bodies, sexuality, and reproduction by families, communities, institutions, and society through the use of multiple tools of oppression based on race, gender, and class. Next slide, please. And so some examples of reproductive oppression, and you can see a whole list of them now, and I won't expound on each and every one of them, but just to lift some out. Population control policies, so either subtle or covert. So as we talked about earlier, the methods of contraceptives that are targeted at certain populations of women who some deem as unfit and incapable of mothering. And so certain forms of population control kinds of contraceptives have historically been targeted at certain populations of women. For example, in the late 80s, early 90s, we saw Norplant be targeted at poor women who were predominantly poor women of color. And during the effort, or during the reform to welfare reform as we know it, courts were actually mandating that certain women be forced to get Norplant, which was then a form of hormonal-based provider-controlled contraceptives. But with certain women were being forced to get Norplant inserted into their arms so that they would not have children. We see those population control policies also with women who may be struggling with substance abuse, that they are forced to or coerced into using certain methods of contraceptives. There's a group on the West Coast called, they used to be called CRAC, Children Requiring a Caring Community. And they were offering women who had substance abuse problems, at the time it was $200 to either get Depo-Provera or to get their tubes tied, and to use other kind of provider-controlled non-barrier methods of contraceptives. What was so insidious about this group was that they didn't even give the women the whole $200 up front a woman had to sign a contract and agree to come back X number of times to get the total $200. So, for example, Depo-Provera, a woman goes to get her shot every 3 months. So you would have to go, it would take you basically a year to get the full $200. The last one that I kind of really want to focus on, and you can, I think the other forms of examples of reproductive oppression are pretty self-explanatory. Using federal policies against abortion, including HIV/AIDS restrictions. And why I kind of want to lift this up, when we talk about the rights of HIV positive women, it's a pretty broad conversation. It is not just about the right of HIV positive women to get an abortion, but it's also about the right of HIV positive women to have children. And that is still contested by some people, including healthcare providers. And so under the RJ framework, we talk a lot about women needing access to comprehensive antenatal delivery and postpartum care that includes antiretroviral therapy, ART, if they are HIV positive, as well as information on options for breastfeeding and bottle feeding in relation to preventing HIV transmission to their babies after birth. We talk about this being their human right, and understanding that for many HIV positive women, they find this hard to exercise, and equally substantially harder to exercise if they are in a domestically violent relationship. We also talk about HIV positive women not being forced into having abortions by folks who believe that women who are living with HIV should not have children. And we talk about respecting the decisions of HIV positive women who don't want to have an abortion, but at the same time talk about the lack of access to safe abortion care for women who are living with HIV. And oftentimes those women are offered, rather than access to health care, offered access to being sterilized, or being told that as a condition of getting a safe abortion, that they have to agree to being sterilized. And so what we talk about under reproductive justice is that we need laws guaranteeing the reproductive rights of women who are HIV positive. And the fact that oftentimes they are more vulnerable to being victims of subtle or covert restrictive reproductive health policies. And then lastly, around religious exemptions, another example of reproductive oppression. And the refusal to issue marriage license to same-sex couples, or to deny them access to services, and also the restrictions on access to clinics that provide abortion care, as we see in the whole women's health case that's currently pending before the Supreme Court. Next slide, please. When we talk about religion and reproductive oppression, one of the things that we sometimes see around attempts to control contraceptive use is this use of various texts from religious traditions to force women into not using birth control. Almost, not almost, but, really saying that women have have to fulfill this duty, this responsibility under certain religious traditions to populate the world, and to populate families. And and so denying women access to forms of contraceptives in the name of adhering to the guidelines of certain religious traditions. That ties into forced reproduction and, using the text, certain religious texts, to support restrictions on abortions, women's access to abortion services, controlling various reproductive health practices. This came up while I was at Black Women for Reproductive Justice. I had never heard of this, but a young woman called us for some support. She was in a domestically violent relationship, and we worked on some sexual assault and domestic violence issues within the context of helping survivors get access to safe abortions and contraceptives, but had never quite been confronted with this one. So her partner had some very definitive thoughts about how about her feminine hygiene practices. And so he was forcing her to douche every month after her menstrual cycle. And not only that, she could not go to church on certain days when she was having her period, because she was unclean, so he said. And also forcing her to, every time she went to the bathroom, and if she changed her pad, because he didn't allow her to use tampons, and she would change her pad, she couldn't like toss it in the trash in the house. She had to wrap it up and take it outside, and put it in the trash outside. And so, he he was standing on his understanding of the Leviticus codes, in the First Testament of the Bible, about the menstrual cycle, and the menstrual cycle, women's menses being dirty and unclean. That was the first time we had ever heard of that. And I'm still like dumbfounded by that. And I said, well, if one person thought of it, surely somebody else is having to experience that same kind of foolishness. And then also lastly, demanding certain sexual practices. And we were hearing about this more frequently than the previous one, of course, when I was at BWRJ, but how certain portions of religious texts, or using the text as authority around how nothing is defiled and no request is unreasonable in a marital union, and marital union being the union between a married man and a woman. And so oftentimes hearing from women that their husbands wanted them to do certain sexual acts that they were not comfortable in doing, but that they felt like they had to do these sexual acts because the pastor said that they should be willing to do whatever their husbands asked them to do in the marital bed, and also that it is their responsibility to fulfill their husbands' sexual needs. Didn't say anything about their own sexual needs, but to fulfill their husbands' sexual needs. And that, this whole notion of that the husband is the head, the woman is the neck, and so, the woman had the neck has to follow the head. It just gets really convoluted, but it makes perfect sense to them, and I suppose I get their line of reasoning, but but having women tell us these stories about the very interesting sexual things that and practices that um, their spouses, that their husbands want them to engage in, and them not feeling like they have the power or the authority to be able to say, I don't want to do that. I don't feel comfortable about doing that. And it may feel good to you, but it doesn't feel good to me. Next slide, please. So I talked about the fact that reproductive justice is grounded in intersectionality. Intersectionality was a model that was developed by Black feminists. As a matter of fact, Kimberly Crenshaw really named intersectionality in 1989 when she talked about how issues like race, class, and gender come together and have this multiple impact upon the lives of women. It's, just kind of anecdotally, when we think back to intersectionality, we have to think back to 1851 when Sojourner Truth pretty much predicted intersectionality when she said, ain't I a woman? And she gave a speech on women at the Women's Rights Convention in Ohio titled Ain't I a Woman, where she talked about all too often woman meant white woman, but it did not look at the fact that Black women are forced to work in the fields and labor and do pretty much of the same things that men have to do. Then we move on to in '69 when Frances Beale, a famous Black feminist, talked about the struggle for liberation faced by Black women, and she did this essay called Double Jeopardy, where she talked about the kind of double jeopardy or multiple oppressions that Black women have to confront. So this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about intersectionality. It really challenges single issue organizing, but it addresses the multiple identities that people have. Next slide, please. So, universality of reproductive justice here, we're just basically saying that reproductive justice is a universal concept created by African American women, but it's universal because of its intersectional and human rights lens. It doesn't mean that we're saying reproductive health and reproductive rights are not viable frameworks, but it says that, you can look at it through shifting lenses. So, like Loretta Ross explains, you go to the eye doctor and the doctor says, you look through multiple lenses to see which lens fits for you. That is the universality of reproductive justice. So, through one lens, reproductive rights, which focuses on the legal aspects of reproduction, may look good for some. Looking through a lens of reproductive health that focuses on access to reproductive and sexual health services may look good for someone else. And another lens could be looking at decentralization of power and placing women in the center as the experts through their lived experiences could be another lens. I think when we talk about vulnerability to social, economic, political attacks, that's pretty self-explanatory because, again, this intersectional analysis, we're also of class, race, and gender. And then when we talk about the choice framework, how it does not really work under the reproductive justice framework, but it doesn't mean that we throw out the choice framework. It does, we're not saying choice doesn't work, but we're saying that there is another way to look at the work. When we talk about, for instance, false moralities, we're talking about using religious texts to deny women's moral capacity and moral authority to make decisions. Next slide, please. This just tells you what we mean when we say when reproductive justice is achieved. So, and this is pretty self-explanatory. Women and girls have economic, social, and political power and resources to make decisions about our bodies, sexuality, and reproduction. Next slide, please. I kind of covered this a little earlier when I talked about reproductive health and reproductive rights. But just real quickly, the reproductive health framework is about service delivery. It is about the necessary health services that individuals need, and it is about providing access where there is no access. The challenge is that the service and education is really limited to the individual level, and it doesn't address the root causes of disparities that make it impossible for women to access services. Legal advocacy is about the lack of legal protection, and the strategy is legal or legislative or advocacy at the state and federal level. The limitation is that it doesn't focus on individual choice or how the focus is on individual choice, and it obscures the social context in which many individuals have to make their decision. Next slide. And here you see really what reproductive justice, the theory and framework, focuses on: a unified social justice movement. It analyzes women's reproductive lives, and it talks about power inequities inherent in institutions, the environment, economics, and our culture. And it talks about how our solutions have to be intersectional and comprehensive. And it talks about the decentralization of power, and that power has to be given, and the agenda has to be driven by those who are most affected by reproductive oppression. Next slide, please. This just talks about some of the challenges to the reproductive justice framework. There are some. No framework is perfect. It's long-term. It requires many more resources and staying power, and the ability to work collaboratively and to work across issues. Next slide. This pretty much says the same thing as the previous slide. I want to get to, go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about the use of religion and reproductive coercion, one of the things that we have is this theology of the principles of reproductive justice. And so as we think about what some of our faith traditions teach us, we know that they don't come out of a theory or a theology of compassion or equality or respect or joy or justice. And that is really what we're talking about at the end of the day. And when we talk about theologies of a theological principle of reproductive justice, it is one that's grounded in compassion. And it is one that talks about the fundamental worth and equality of every person. And it talks about respecting the moral decisions as a sacred part of what it means to be human. And it talks about respect for different opinions, and it talks about the core principles of people being able to make decisions according to their own conscience and values. It also talks about joy, that sex is a sacred gift from the Creator and from the universe and from God, and that sexuality has been badly damaged from fear and shame and exploitation. And then lastly, it talks about justice, that it talks about the importance of caring for people and groups who, for reasons of poverty and race and gender and other kinds of isms and forms of oppression, are denied justice as a central part of our understanding of our faith, but that justice is central to our understanding of faith. And that as a part of that understanding, it's incumbent upon us to eliminate these disparities that prevent people from accessing or realizing their rights and accessing resources so that they can live healthy reproductive and sexual lives. So I'm going to end there. There are resources at the end for further reading, and I think we still have some time for questions.
Thank you, Toni. Wow, that was a rush through the end. This is a lot of information. We do have a question that came in. Let me try to paraphrase this the best I can. The idea seems to be that liberation theologies have almost always centered around the rights of men. And you seem to be talking about a liberation theology that takes into account the experience of women. And how easy is it to mesh those ideas? And is it possible, or are people doing it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when we look at womanist theology, when we look at Methodist theology, when we look at some of the writings from Asian women theologians, I mean, we see how they are grounding their their writings in liberation kind of theology lens, but also offering this feminist lens or offering this womanist lens that that talks about not just liberation from this male perspective, but talks about liberation in terms of the womanist perspective or the feminist perspective. So I think that some folks are certainly already writing in this way. I think what the reproductive justice theory and framework offers is for us to begin to think about the ways in which women have had to live through varying forms of reproductive oppression, and for us to expand how we think about reproductive and sexual oppression. But I think certainly folks have been writing in this way already, centering liberation theology around the rights of women.
Thank you. So we have a lot of advocates with us today, and I know that we get a lot of questions about how to address concerns that survivors and victims have that are based in faith texts, as you were talking about. Do you have any suggestions, recommendations, ways to talk to survivors to kind of share this?
Well, I think it's important to affirm with survivors that that their lives are sacred, and that their lives and their sexuality and their reproduction all are gifts from the Creator or the universe, or however they acknowledge God in their lives, and to affirm their worth, and to affirm their moral authority and their moral capacity. I mean, I think one of the gifts that we get from, for instance, womanist theology is to very fearlessly, challenge those texts that we know that promote violence against women, and to say, no, the text is not, that's not a compassionate text. That's not an affirming text of women. It's not a respectful text of women. And so I think, we have to be courageous as advocates, working in the faith community, as theologians, as ethicists. I consider myself an ethicist. We have to be willing to speak out and say, well, no, those texts aren't affirming of people's human right, of people's moral capacity, of people's value as human beings. And we have to be willing to offer revised thinking about the text. And even, the beauty of one of the things that womanist theology offers is to offer new forms of canonical text. That could be film, that could be movies, that could be song, but things that affirm individual rights and individual autonomy and respect for people to live in affirming and violence-free societies, especially our most vulnerable, which we know are women and girls.
Thank you. A, a couple of months ago, we have a Meaningful Voices book club, and one of the books that we read was called Uncovered, and it was a woman she was a Hasidic woman, and she had had 7 children and was pregnant again and just didn't think that she could handle it, physically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. And it's a memoir about her experience, and the one thing that she talked about was that she turned the decision over to the rabbi to decide whether she should or could have an abortion. And that years later, that's one of her biggest regrets, was that that was not a decision that she had the right, or she felt she had the right to make. And so I think part of what I wonder is, how do we reach out to women who are in situations of very repressive religious situations, and that is their life, that's their community, that's their belief system, and yet it is dangerous to their life situation. Do you have any suggestions?
Sure. So one way is, to reach out. For instance, you may have some women's ministries who think in a different kind of way. You may have some female leadership in the church, meaning women who are leadership of ministries, who might be open to thinking a different kind of way. And our organizing doesn't necessarily have to be within the church per se. What you're trying to do is to reach out to women of faith who may attend churches, and to create spaces where women of faith can come and talk about, some of these kinds of issues and how they are impacting their lives, and ways in which we can affirm women's moral authority and moral capacity, because that's who we're talking about. At the core of this, that we have to affirm women's moral authority and capacity to be able to make decisions about their lives and their bodies. And so I think it's not either or, it's and. You try and work within the ways that you can within religious institutions and with leadership, and also creating the spaces sometimes outside of the institutions where women can come together, right? And perhaps break bread and be in community, form communities that are affirming of each other, affirming of women, and supporting women in the decisions that they have to make.
Thank you. So this is the last question. I know that you are very involved with making bridges between activists, advocates, and the academy, the 3As. What do you see as the future? How do you see that happening? What's your hope? What do you want to happen?
Well, my hope is that, being an activist, being from the activist community myself for over 25 years, and now being in the world of the academy, I see myself kind of like as this bridge, right, between the grassroots RJ community and the academy, and being able to speak to kind of what are the challenges of grassroots activists working in the faith community and what their needs are. And now being a member of the academy and being able to say, hey, let's remove this kind of gap, and knowing that grassroots activists are saying, listen, there's some things, some writings that we need from you in the academy that can support our work in faith communities as we try and help folks to understand that there isn't just one theology, but there are multiple theologies of reproductive justice. And then from the grassroots perspective, grassroots activists, they have valuable stories and lived experiences that I think would be beneficial to scholars in the academy as they do their research, as they do their writings about, for instance, womanist theology and Methodist theology. And so I think that there are some very valuable relationships to be forged there.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. We appreciate it. So, Toni, I want to thank you so much for this presentation. It's a lot of information, and we would love to have you back to talk some more. Before everybody signs out today, I want to let you know that our next webinar is on July 7th, and it is the role of the faith community in preventing and healing child sexual abuse. So we're going to be talking about adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and how to work with adult survivors as well as child survivors. And also the recording of part 1 of our conversation on reproductive and sexual coercion is available on our website, and you will get this information in your inbox today. And lastly, we have our online book club, and we're reading The Roundhouse on July 20th. We're going to have a conversation. It should be interesting, fascinating. It's a powerful book. We hope that you will join us. So as you sign off today, if you would please take a moment and fill out the survey, give us your feedback about today, ideas for future webinars, we would be so appreciative. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.